Welcome to My Dad's Car, a podcast discussing our personal relationship with automotive nostalgia. And you know what? It doesn't even have to be about your dad's car. It can be your mum's, your grand's, your parents', guardians, or even a neighbour's. If it made an impression, let's talk about it. Hi everyone, just a quick note before we start the show. We've set up a supporter programme, so if you're enjoying the podcast, you can give us a tip. Head over to our website, MyDadsCar.co.uk, where you can either make a one-off donation or sign up to give us a £3 a month bump start. We'll put that towards equipment and hosting costs. Now, back to the show. Enjoy. Hello.
Hi Andy, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Yourself?
Good, fine, thank you.
John, Tim, John.
Morning, John.
Hi Tim, how you doing?
You're very good, thanks. You?
Yeah, not too bad.
So, yeah, we'll start. For the benefit of the tape, I used to work with Tim at the motor spares place before I came to work with you, John.
Really? Goodness me.
We try not to mention the H word, Tim.
Indeed.
No.
Yeah. It was good times. Good times.
I think back when the signage was blue rather than orange, probably.
Yeah.
Wasn't it?
Yeah, blue team, I think.
Wow. Amazing. That must have been some years ago then.
It was when they still had rip speed and it still had some form of brand equity to it.
There could be a separate podcast dedicated to the tales of that place, couldn't there? I think. Yeah.
There could.
So, yeah, let's dive in. Thanks for obviously your enthusiasm about what we're doing, Tim. It's most appreciated. And obviously we caught up at Goodwood the other day. So yeah, thank you very much for letting my two climb all over your race car as well.
Not a problem. It's do you know what? It's one of the really lovely things about Goodwood as an event, but also it's just seeing kids interact with proper cars.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, that is, if I can give one thing back to people that turn up to events like that, it's the chance to kind of get up close and get kids involved and enthusiastic about it, because otherwise they're not going to have the memories we're going to talk about, I suppose.
Absolutely. So, yeah, straight into it, I guess. What's your earliest car memory?
Do you know, I've been reflecting on that in the last week. I thought, I'm going to have to come up with some stuff ahead of this conversation. I think I guess there's early car memories.
Yeah.
Where, my dad had a series of cars. My mum had some cars that were kind of functional, serve purpose, and that he at that time had a job which gave him a company car. And then there are the cars that sit as being iconic in my childhood memory. And they're a bit different, if that makes sense.
Shall we start with let's get a boring one on the cards, then we can.
Boring one. Rover 827 hatch.
Wow.
Yeah. I think it was red.
What sort of year is the 827? I'm not too up on my Rovers.
I'm going to go late 80s, I think, John.
Okay.
A bit like an SD1, wasn't it? Sort of rounded SD1.
It was sort of a slightly updated SD1.
Okay.
It lost all the cool points that an SD1 had, and gained sort of the value of a Kleenex man-sized tissue box on the back shelf and a flat cap. It wasn't, but it did have quite a good engine in it, and yeah, I do remember it being quite quick, but it was sort of, it was kind of classic company car for, I suppose, mid-level exec that sort of, it was okay. So I remember that. And I think, clearly the company he worked for had a bit of a thing for British cars in the late 80s. So there were a couple of Rovers, and that probably was the cars that sit out in my mind, I suppose. We subscribed, I suppose, privately outside of company cars to something that stuck with me, which is probably the theory we call in the family, at least, bangonomics.
Yeah. Which
is like the principle of just not having something where we're going to go in and buy it and then watch the depreciation fall off in the first 2 years or so. So I've never really had new car experiences, I suppose. I remember my mum having a car she had a Fiat Uno when I was growing up. So I think it was a 45.
Yeah.
They graded them by numbers, and I think it was a 1 litre of 45. And that wasn't quick. I remember the Rover being quick, but the Uno not being quick. And kind of that classic Italian 80s build quality where, you shut one door and the other side popped open.
Like a clown car.
It was sort of, but yet weirdly quite competent. It was kind of, it's a bit like an Alpha, isn't it? It sort of puts every bit of adventure back into motoring. So I remember those quite vividly. She had a Nova as well, which wasn't an SR, which troubled me greatly as a child, but it was great. And those cars were iconic. And then I think my dad then kind of transitioned into Golfs. So I suppose the first car that really sticks in my memory was a C plate, small bumper, black Mk2 8 valve.
Okay.
And I probably because of necessity, my dad bought an 8-valve rather than a 16-valve, I suspect, just because it was there. And then insisted on telling me for the preceding like 5 years that he owned it, that an 8-valve was the thinking man's Golf GTI, and it was torquier, and and it was, there was all the reasons that you didn't buy a KR, but it was just that was his logic was that, and I think it was probably just because that's what he bought. But I remember that car very vividly. Yeah, three-door black sunroof Mark II GTI, and that introduced VW Golfs, and they became iconic to me, but also as a performance car now. I mean, I'd love to have that car back, actually.
Yeah.
And then we had another Mark II, a J plate, oak green, 16-valve. Now that is a car I'd like back. That one, that would be a very cool car to have back. That was on BBS RAs and a really late car, so that was nicely spec rainbow interior and everything.
So it's a big bumper one, isn't it? I'm not a VW guy. So,
big bumper one. If you were collecting Golfs now, because they're starting to be pretty sought after, that's kind of the one that you would want. Yeah,
good choice.
A late oak green car.
I did always prefer the big bumpers personally. And the green, very nice.
It was a great car. And I think the other thing that as a child you remember so much is not just the car. You're sort of slightly more agnostic to the technology, but it was the way it was driven. Without telling all the tales of my dad's driving on the road, given that he did what I now do and race fairly seriously, he drove it with a reasonable degree of enthusiasm. Should we describe it that way? And I think it was probably the experiences of mild terror in the car which would probably make it more iconic than anything else, actually. I remember the black Mark II on the A24 around Horsham in pursuit of a moonstone blue 3-door RS Cosworth. And we made a good showing of the Mark II. and I think much to the frustration of the RS owner, but when we got to the roundabout at the other end, he did stop us and question whether it was standard. And I think my dad felt quite enthusiastic about that, and I was sort of there and on promise not to tell mum when I got home that was the sort of the journey back.
I think that makes a kind of a big difference. So if you can drive, I remember going up to No Rice, kind of when we used to drive up in the Volkswagen. You went up in a work van one day, and we were hacking through the country lanes of Guildford, and you were off. Whatever we were in following you, we just couldn't keep up, and you were in this work van, giving it 110%.
I mean, a Mercedes Sprinter, Andy, don't underestimate them. Quite a capable beast.
I don't think it was a Sprinter.
Was it not?
It was a Caddy, possibly.
Okay.
Or something along those lines. But
we did have a series when we were running the race teams. We had a series of differing vans, all of which got driven fairly enthusiastically. But there was a Caddy in the fleet at one point. So that was probably
maybe it had been modified, Andy.
Oh, possibly, yeah.
Yeah.
So obviously, you alluded to your dad being in motorsport. Do you remember his race car? Was he competing or was he just preparing?
So my first ever memory is literally my first, and I've kind of questioned my mum over my age, but I reckon I was probably just about 3, maybe a little bit younger, was going up to collect Formula V.
Okay.
And I can't remember huge amounts about it other than I remember kind of pulling into this alleyway of garages behind terraced houses, and there about halfway down the alleyway was the nose of a Formula V sticking out, and the guy was half pushing it out of the garage, and I remember that so vividly. And I questioned my dad about it. He was like, I don't remember that kind of particular bit of it, but it sits so clearly in my mind, and I suppose it's probably now set me up for quite a lot of life, that love affair of cars and racing cars. But it feels that was such a kind of pivotal moment, and I suppose appropriate that it was car related.
Yeah. I guess, did you go with your dad racing kind of at weekends and things like that?
Yeah, I did. So he was racing a bit when I was little, and then he wasn't racing so much. I think that probably like a lot of new dads with small children, and that one thing takes over and life priorities change as you've got children, and so he was doing less of that at that time. But I remember going to various race circuits with him. My grandfather was very passionate about cars and bikes particularly. So I remember going with him for trips to race circuits as well. And then when I was probably about 7, I suppose, my dad started a kart circuit.
He started one.
Yeah. So
amazing.
So that then became quite a dominant influence. And, you know, for me, any spare time that I had was kind of there, really, either working as a marshal or just hanging around, but kind of taking all of that atmosphere and stuff in, and you become, I suppose, by osmosis, right? You just soak up all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And yeah, so for me, that access to cars, competition, and motoring's always been there.
Well, that's fantastic. That must have been brilliant.
Yeah.
Home from school, helmet on.
Yeah,
it's going to go and have a play.
Yeah, it was pretty remarkable, and you know, particularly when I look at kind of the kids and the drivers that came through the kart circuit, you know, and now have gone on to lots of other things. It's amazing to think that's kind of the exposure that he was able to create for them, and the opportunity that he was able to create for them, and so that in itself is special. And for me, growing up in that kind of environment, it gave me the opportunity to compete, to learn to drive. And I think driving is something that becomes so ingrained. You know, for me, there is nothing that gives me that true focus. I mean, when you're driving a racing car on the edge, there is nothing that comes into your brain because there is no space or capacity for anything else. But it's also remarkable that when you get out of it at the end, actually kind of there's clarity in other areas of your brain and you're thinking that just weren't there when you got in it. It's, you know, the power of your brain to focus on certain things. It's almost like it can do one thing and it relaxes and kind of processes other stuff that it's been struggling with. And that's an incredible element. But the competition, the people, and it becomes very much a lifestyle. You know, it's funny, in the build up, I was talking to an owner that I now race for this weekend, and we were talking about the fact that, you know, in advance of an event, you live in this kind of world of elevated adrenaline. Everything is about anticipation towards the event, often for weeks in advance. And then you go through the weekend. It kind of takes you a while to come down afterwards. And then for the week or two afterwards can feel quite hollow. And suddenly you're like, well, I need to go and do this again. When can I go and do it again? So yeah, I think when people describe motorsport, particularly as a bug that you catch, I think it's that kind of elevated adrenaline, which is pretty difficult to replace.
That's quite interesting. I've never really thought of motor racing as something that can kind of, like, people will go down to the gym for an hour to sort of get that release from everyday life and what might be going around their head. But no, that's interesting to sort of think of you going around a motor circuit for a couple of hours, and it's exactly the same sort of thing. But I mean, it makes complete sense when you put it like that.
Yeah, it really does, John. I think, you know, I guess for anything where you're fully applying your thought process, your brain, and you're pushing yourself into that element of kind of, you know, driving your mental focus, actually that frees up, I think, space somehow in your brain, allows processing, but also gives you that element of escapism. And, you know, for me, that whole focus of an event, the build up towards the event, you know, that in itself is quite empowering in some ways. You know, there's an element of responsibility when you're in the car. You're the only person that can really materially change the outcome when the car's left the pit lane. But it's also, it's how do you build a high performing team around you? How do you ask for people to give more in terms of kind of their involvement? You know, how do you encourage? And so there's lots of factors there that build kind of towards success and kind of what that looks like. But yeah, it's fantastic, and it's quite difficult sometimes to explain it to people as well, because that experience is, as you say, I guess for somebody that does mountain biking or paragliding or sailing or loves going to the gym and working out intensively and pushing themselves to something, they find that freedom in that same way.
So I guess when you were racing, let's see if we can kind of jump on board. If perhaps maybe look at your first car race, would your dad put your car on the trailer, tow you there or whatever? Yeah,
definitely.
And take us there. What was he towing you with? Did he have music on? Let's sort of set the scene.
Okay, so my first car race was an event down at Castlecombe in Wiltshire, and the British Racing and Sports Car Club had created a series called T-Cars, which was like a junior touring car formula.
Okay.
And it was the first time that kids under 16 had been allowed to go and race cars. And these were, Vauxhall red top, 150 brake horsepower, 2 litres, 1600 on carbs, on 45s. And they were proper bit of kit. They were really well put together. And Tom Chilton was competing. A guy called Stuart Hall. Stuart is now a very successful GT driver. Tom Kimber-Smith, so multiple Le Mans winner. There was really good quality of kids involved, and drivers had gone to do a lot of other stuff. And T-Cars was this kind of breeding ground of future racing drivers, and they put a lot of additional support in place around it. If you were part of the program, they gave you media training, and all of that was quite unusual in the late 90s. It was just something that hadn't been done before. Junior drivers were kind of thrown out of karting into Formula Ford, the single-seater route. There was really no conceived alternative to going and doing single-seater. Now, I'm 6'4". I'm not naturally designed to be a racing driver. I should have probably taken up rowing or basketball or something, but I fell in love with that. I'm
6'4" as well, Tim, and I took up none of those options. So if that makes you feel any better.
Yeah, we'll come on to another story in a moment. But the whole T-Cars process was pretty interesting. We've been through a lot of that training and the media training and stuff beforehand. And I remember, Andy, I really can't remember anything about the journey to Castlecombe. I was so terrified.
How old were you?
I was 15, just 15. And I just remember the fear, actually. In fact, my stepfather drove me in a J-plate Vauxhall Cavalier, red one, horrendous car it was.
Lovely.
And I remember that probably quite vividly. And there was something weird about that time. Maybe fuel strikes, late 90s, truck drivers deliver. I can't remember. But I remember that slightly as well. And but I just remember that overwhelming sense of like the most intense butterflies I'd ever experienced, and that kind of almost nausea building of kind of, how do you feel ahead of something? And the weirdest sensation of all of that is you feel almost physically sick of kind of like, oh my God, what's going to happen? And then you get in the car and the car leaves the pit lane and it goes.
Yeah.
And it's like instant focus on, right, this is going to happen now. And this, but it's, remarkable. And that, John, thinking about 6'4", I remember going to see a Marcos. So I was very lucky at 17 to transition from racing T-Cars and then a bit of time in Formula Ford to going and racing in British GT in a Marcos. And I remember going up to see the car, and it was run by Guy Butler Henderson at the time, who was Vicky's dad, the motoring journalist dad. And I remember going to sit in the car, and he said, well, this is the car, you better sit in it, make sure you're comfortable. I got in it. It was the least comfortable thing I've ever sat in. I had my head on one side like this, and I had my knees kind of out around my elbows. And he looked at me and he was like, how is it? I was like, it's perfect, Guy. It's perfect. And it was just this kind of just absolute,
straight to the chiropractor afterwards.
There was no way it was perfect, but there was also no way I wasn't going to take the opportunity and go and drive it. Pretty amazing. I think, Andy, when you look back probably at those journeys that you remember and think about that, probably some of my karting stuff as a kid is almost more memorable in some ways. And because my parents had divorced, my weekends were often spent with my dad. They became very intensively focused on racing because I was competing in national karting. And so we would go off and we would go all over the country as part of that. So it might be up to a place called Lark Hall at Glasgow in Scotland, or over to Nuts Corner in Ireland, or, it becomes this kind of real network of space around the country, and normally in a van. And we had a Volkswagen LT35 Luton, surprisingly quick, at least when you encouraged it on.
When your dad's driving.
Yeah, exactly. And what else? We had a Transit for a while, the classic Transit, and a Sprinter.
At what point, Tim, do you think your dad, how was he in terms of like encouragement in you sort of getting into driving? Did he notice you had like a natural flair for it, or early on?
I think for me, I'm always torn a little bit on that question, John, because I was so fortunate to have had the exposure to karting so early that a little bit of me occasionally, if I'm having my imposter syndrome a little bit in it, kind of says, well, I've done my 10,000 hours, right? Like I've built up that logic of being, so I almost can't not be good at it, right? Like even if I'm not great at it, I've done so much of it, I haven't got any excuses anymore. So I've got to be good at it. And then part of it, because that's a self-compounding part of being a racing driver, is that you've got to, you feel an element of confidence, right? Like I'm pretty assured of my own ability in a car. I think that comes as part of doing what we do. You've got to be capable and confident of doing that, at least at a reasonably high level. I think for my dad, there was always a view that he had a love for the sport and he wanted to share that passion and enthusiasm with me. Was that going to be something that he pushed on me? Probably not. And I think my mum was quite a good balance there of, you don't have to go and do this. But also, I'm quite, in some ways, quite a similar character to him. The things that he loved about the sport were probably also the things that motivated me about it. Mm-hmm. As I say, that element of thriving on adrenaline, something that, if I was to psychometrically profile myself, which I've done at various points for work and things like that, but, I kind of come out as a bit of a flip. Like I'm a red, so I'm quite a decision orientated, quick paced person, but then I've also got a really strong attention to detail, but only when that detail makes things go faster. Mm-hmm. And so racing is something where I think if you've got that right split, it can empower a lot of value in yourself, and something that I've loved doing. And I've never felt that pressure to go and do it. It's always been by choice. I think perhaps what happened to me more significantly in my early 20s was that I was racing, and I was fortunate to be racing at a pretty high level, and it probably wasn't making me the nicest person to be around all the time. And I felt a little bit like I was talented at something, and I felt like I deserved an opportunity. Yeah. In motorsport, I felt like the sport kind of owed me an opportunity. And actually, subsequently, I took quite a lot of time out, and I didn't race for probably 6 or 7 years in my later 20s and early 30s. And I came back to it with a totally different view. I came back to it with a view around kind of gratitude and enthusiasm, and just transferred all of that passion for competition into passion for the product in terms of the car. And I love the cars. I love the history of the cars. I love helping people to access that and understand it. And working with people to improve their own driving now is probably as much of a satisfaction as it is for myself driving in the car. Mm-hmm. And that's quite a material change. It might look quite similar, but in some ways to an outsider, but it's quite a significant change of mindset. It's been interesting to see the result of that too, is that I think when you're focused only on the individual, actually those opportunities in my early 20s kind of shut themselves down, because perhaps I wasn't as committed as I thought I was, or wasn't approaching things in the right way. And then now coming back to it with that kind of just enthusiasm and passion for the product rather than for myself in that situation. Mm-hmm. And suddenly it opens up in a totally different way.
So at the moment, obviously, you've been racing classic stuff. Are the vehicles you're racing now, do you think, influenced by kind of your dad's either previous vehicles or...
Yeah, I think so.
What you were growing up with? Because obviously, I guess you were in like a 50s Fraser Nash, weren't you? But you're also in like the Triumph Dolomite, which is what, late 70s, early 80s?
Yeah, exactly. And yes, I think so. I think heavily, probably, as a combination of my dad's involvement, probably my granddad's influence as well. I've always been told that, wire wheels and carburettors are better, right? That's basically the school of thought in the car church in our house, as it were, is this kind of, wire wheels and carburettors are better. And it just becomes ingrained. And I love old cars, but I think the other thing that I love is the story that they tell. When you can connect the dots of cars, and you can start to look at the history and what they unlock. And particularly when you can write yourself into that history a little bit as just part of being able to deal with a car with an incredible history. I mean, the Dolomite that we were out with at members meeting, that car was there. It was the first time it had raced since 1980. It didn't bathe itself in glory, particularly at Goodwood, but it will do. It will come back, and it's amazing to think, that car so passionately invested into at the time. It was ran, it's languished for, and it kind of needs to be invested in and improved and sorted. And that's really kind of the nice thing about bringing historic race cars back into activity. Old racing cars, I suppose, are only old racing cars until they're raced again, and then people feel perhaps a bit more of an emotional investment and engagement back into them.
So are you adverse to racing newer stuff?
No, not at all. And I think, modern cars can be, they can create that same passion and enthusiasm, and actually kind of what I still consider as a modern car, probably in my mind is still a contemporary GT car, but it's probably 20 years old. Like, I was walking up and down that GT1 parade at Goodwood and looking at the cars in the garages there, and they are, to my mind, still some of the most impressive racing cars ever built. You look at the 550 GT1, you look at the Listers, you look at the Celine, they're incredible. I mean, the Marcos, I have a bit of a brand affinity for the Marcos, but that Coruza Marcos, the LM600, that's still one of the most mad looking cars ever. And so, yeah, I think the modern stuff is still incredible. I'm not so sold, if I'm honest, on the kind of the Formula E direction of the sport. And I lose a bit of interest in that. And I think perhaps Formula One has moved beyond the function of sport at its truest level. And I think, when we look at the spectator appeal that's created and you look at the passion and the enthusiasm, I think actually we have to be careful to balance that within motorsport. But yeah, for me, cars are visceral. I want them to sound right. I want them to feel right. The Marcos or the Corvette rumbled past at members meeting and you felt it kind of here, right? And so that's something too. Smell is important in cars. In fact, that's a weird dad fact. I don't know why. I think it was because my dad left home very early in the mornings to go to work, but he always took a banana with him. So my overwhelming iconic memory of the Mk2 Golf GTIs, either in the black or was they smelt of bananas. So Sean, my wife, opened up a cool bag the other day and it had bananas in for my kids' picnics. And I opened it and I was like, oh my God, it's a Mk2 Golf GTI. And it just instant smell back of that. Yeah, strange, isn't it? How certain things are instantly take you back to somewhere. But I suppose a combination of bananas and fuel probably in a Mk2 Golf GTI.
I get the smell thing. My dad was a coach trimmer, so old classic car interiors. So if I've kind of stick my head inside something that's sort of musty leather, that is just kind of that's brilliant.
Yeah, I totally agree. And a friend of mine at university, he had Mk2 GTI as well. It must be something about my passion for them was spreading and contagious. And he had a Mk2 Golf GTI, and he bought himself this leather care kit from Germany. And he and I funded our way through university buying BBS wheels on German eBay and selling them in the UK. That was sort of one of our side hustles at university, if you like. And that was pre-e-commerce. We're like, this is 2002. And he bought this leather care kit, and he treated all of the leather in his Mk2. And for the following 6 months, it was like walking into a saddler's. Like it was just like there was this kind of weird combination of like saddlers and old gentleman's club with like excessive leather chairs. And it was this sort of amazing combination. But it was incredible. I'd forgotten about that. Like I really wish I'd have gone back in the late 90s. I'd have bought a whole load of headlinings for Mk2 Golf GTIs and a whole load of rear parcel shelves, because they are the two things where you just finding original good quality ones now is really difficult. And there are trimmers out there plenty that make good replicas, but would be lovely to do that. But then I suppose that there's a lot of tales of cars like that, and cars kind of, it's one of the things I've always found fascinating is this kind of value slump and where values start to correct again.
So we were talking recently about the R129 Mercedes that someone else who was on the podcast has just bought, and we sort of think they must have bottomed out at this point. They must have done. They must be starting to creep. But it's like stocks and shares, isn't it? Really.
It is, and I remember talking to the guys at Bonhams about it a few years ago, and they were talking about, you know, kind of following the wealth in terms of the cars that are iconic to our childhood. You know, at the point that then, you know, we're perhaps a bit more settled in employment. You know, we've perhaps gone through the kind of the money sponge of small children, and then we're kind of coming back out the other end. And so at what point do those people start to realize more material elements of disposable income and then choose to invest back into the cars? And it's the cars that they saw and were iconic as kids. And I think, you know, for me now, that would be, we're certainly seeing that £600,000+ for a 3-door RS Cosworth at the auctions, you know, is a pretty incredible tale of that. Because I think what I found amazing about that is that's not just one buyer that's valuing it at £600,000+. That's two competing bidders that are valuing it at that kind of level. And so that's it's pretty remarkable when you're starting to see that kind of number. But I suppose that is where, you know, you could argue that 50s cars are kind of a little softer than they were, because perhaps generationally there's not so many of those guys around. 60s, 70s, you know, kind of where's the reality for those? But, you know, 80s, 90s cars, the kind of cars that were at Goodwood for the GT1 celebration, you know, you'd see now kind of skyrocketing. And I suspect there's a few things in there that, you know, I would love to go out and buy a car that was iconic for me as a kid, was like a really good S2000. I'm not sure I've ever found a really good one, if I'm honest, but there must be one out there, and probably a combination of, I think it was that in silver and driven by Jennifer Love Hewitt when she was sort of slightly more realistic as an individual. And that was sort of a good combination of the early 2000s. It would be nice to get one.
I suppose it all ties in, isn't it, to Dad's cars, really, the ones that are sort of going up in value. Maybe that's an idea, Andy, for an auction name, My Dad's Car Auction. Trademark that one.
Little spin-off.
Do you know, I genuinely think, but they are the cars that we found iconic as kids, right? I mean, the guy that raced the Dolomite 4 has an amazing collection of cars, and they are cars that he has found iconic and interesting through his life. And, you know, it's a very varied selection, but, you know, I love that kind of intrigue and interest in the car and things as well. And when you get into a position where you can afford to go and buy them and indulge them. And well, there you go. Maybe you've just created your new auction platform, John.
We're only going to do Rover 827s.
Well, these days, Andy, that will be a niche market.
Very niche.
Get lots of people whose dads are in the CID.
Yeah, it does. It feels like the detective car, right? That's the.
I suppose that kind of takes us a little bit back to the road. And is there anything, Tim, that your dad had, or maybe still has, that you might sort of think about indulging in yourself one day, or maybe you already have?
So a Mark II definitely would be on my list. Yeah. He had a Mark II Scirocco as well. I quite like that as a car. I probably in some ways thought that was quite a cool car as a coupe rather than a hatch.
You had a Scirocco, Andy?
No, I've driven one once, but I don't mind them. They were a bit of a dirty secret, weren't they, for a while? Like, it was, you had to like the Golf, but actually kind of on the side.
Wouldn't I be right in saying that wouldn't be great for the taller man either? They're quite low down.
There's a fair bit of space.
They're pretty reclined.
Right. Okay.
But I think for cars, he had a Calibra.
Nice.
Don't see many of those anymore.
No.
And he had a 2-litre 16-valve Calibra. I remember that well. But he always aspired. They did a Calibra 4x4 turbo.
What colour?
His was very dark green.
I was going to say dark green. Yeah, a chap used to live near me. He had a thing for them. He had a red one and then moved on to the green. I think, again, that was a 4x4. Very nice. Yeah, back in the day.
Was it? Yeah, I was going to say, do you know, I reckon, I've never been in one, but a 2-litre turbo 4x4 Calibra probably was quite a weapon. And they did look good when they ran them in the DTM. Slightly different spec, I would admit, but they did look pretty good in the DTM.
True.
But I suspect they're probably pretty prone to the tin worm. So I'm not sure how many of them are out there anymore, but be quite fun to find out. And otherwise, car, yeah, it is that. It's a small bumper C plate black Mark II that smells of bananas. That's probably the car I would go and buy back, right? That's the weird thing about it. Probably because of what it meant as much as the car itself.
You need to set up a Friday ad or something, Gumtree saying, seeking greengrocer owned C-Reg Golf.
Yeah, it's so I think those, and then vans, because of karting, because of everything else. Not that I'm likely to go instantly buy a van, but I remember a lot of kind of experiences of driving around the country with him in a van full of karting kit, spending a lot of our time, kind of dad and lad time as it were, was spent on road trips because we were going off to race circuits, or we were going off to find bits of racing cars for him, for himself, or for customers. I think the other important thing about cars, actually, from that point of view, cars can be great discussion places. They can be great places to kind of download your thoughts, and in a funny kind of way. And I've kind of thought about it subsequently. I think particularly for guys, because you don't sit face to face. You're not looking at each other somehow.
That's true.
You're sitting kind of shoulder to shoulder, and somehow that feels like it's an easier place to have a conversation. And, if I think back to some of my most iconic, important life conversations, they were probably all in cars. Perhaps when you wanted to say something that was a bit awkward that you didn't want to say to somebody, perhaps when you were being told something, that you were perhaps not doing what you should have been doing. And kind of those moments often were somehow in car journeys. And I think that's kind of a secondary importance that sometimes I forget about with cars, as growing up, was their importance in that as well.
The tricky thing with that, I remember, obviously I spent a lot of time in the car with my dad because we lived apart as well, was that if you had something that was kind of importance to say, you had to kind of gauge it right, because if you got it wrong, you had another hour in this car with that person to kind of either sit in silence or kind of try and mop it up and backstep. And
yeah. But it teaches you the art of discussion, right? I mean, there's a fine thing to balancing that. And, do you get to 3 hours and 59 minutes of a 4-hour car journey and drop the massive message that you've been waiting there for? Or do you...
Maybe that's why Sean Connery had that ejector seat in the Aston all those years ago. Disagree.
Yeah, I think that's, that's an important part of them too. Not just in the physical car, but kind of what they do and they unlock and they empower.
Can you see yourself becoming van dad going karting with your two?
Oh, good question. I think I'd put myself in a similar place to my dad, that I would never want to force it on them. But also it's something where I can already recognize that they have an interest and a passion for it. Probably wanting to kind of separate my enthusiasm from theirs and allow them to, if they want to do it, to culture it themselves. Unless something materially changes in the next couple of years, I can't imagine myself starting a kart circuit with them. So I guess their access to it would be a bit different, unless Sian's going to suddenly become, unless she suddenly wants to spend all of her time at a kart circuit rather than at home.
Yeah.
I think, that I hope perhaps at least that they have an enthusiasm for cars, and they have an understanding of the history of cars. I mean, I went up to a place in Northumbria for a Ford rally day, and I was I guess probably 15 or 16, and there was a day that Ford were running on their rally school, and it was run by a guy called Chris Birkbeck. And at the beginning of the day, he said, "Can I just have a quick show of hands for the number of people that have driven themselves here?" And so basically most people put their hands up. And he said, "No, you've all traveled here. None of you have driven here." And I was like, okay, interesting definition. What's the difference? And he said, well, look, driving a car is being in full control, fully focused. It's owning the experience. It's making sure that you're inputting and controlling the car, not the car inputting and controlling you. He said, if you've traveled here in a car on the road, that's different. But driving a car is about control of the car. It's about sensitivity to the car. And that was kind of an illuminating comment and conversation for me. And I hope that my kids get an opportunity to get an involvement in cars in that way, in the direction of travel that we've got with technology in cars. We've got cars generally that the experience they have is going to be quite different. Is the reality of having a right pedal and a manual gearbox going to be there for them?
I live in London, so I'm not even sure if my children will bother to learn to drive. It's a possibility, isn't it? Yeah.
I agree. It really is. And, I think for me, I want them to have that same emotional element of experience in a car, probably more than it's funny, isn't it? But I suppose I hope that I can culture that interest and passion for cars in their truest sense, in their analog sense, and it's one of the things that I find most engaging now about racing historics is perhaps some of that simplicity of technology and actually realizing that a car that's still incredibly simple can be incredibly competent. I suppose going back to dad memories of cars, that is one of the defining factors. Cars were just different in the 80s to they are now. And, it was quite normal that you would navigate out of kind of this tiny patch of the windscreen for at least the first mile of the journey until everything had cleared. But we just don't work like that anymore. And I think maybe we need to.
The trouble is, isn't it? Oh, this is a huge conversation, but the car manufacturers don't want to make cars that are like a sort of bag for life. I've used that term before. They want you to just keep coming back, don't they, every couple of years and getting the next thing. So
yeah, I've had a bit of a kind of rumble running around in my head for the last year or two, which is that actually I think cars kind of reached their peak of mechanical efficiency probably in the early 2000s. And actually, I'm amazed that there is nobody that's really got into the remanufacture of cars. Like we talk about, if you take kind of the idea of a gold seal engine stuff, the stuff that went off to a repairer and came back as a reconditioned engine. Why nobody has taken, because we've talked lots about Golfs, but why nobody's taken a Mark IV Golf, effectively disassembled it, put a little bit of simple modern technology in it, but also engineered out all the stuff that we now know 20 years later is the weak points of the car and put the car back together. I mean, the reality is that car will probably run for another 200,000 miles with a vastly reduced carbon footprint because we're not re-embodying that carbon in the construction and raw materials.
I think that's definitely a great point. The early 2000s era, Mark IV Golfs is a great example. There's still so many around. BMWs are the same era, sort of E46s, E39s still chugging around.
Absolutely, and they're still great cars.
But sadly, a lot of them are going to be scrapped this year because of the ULEZ expansion. So yeah, it's someone's missing a trick, really. I think there's definitely something in that. But
I really feel quite strongly about that, John. I think the potential impact of some of the clean air zones in the ULEZ, whilst delivering the right kind of aspiration in terms of sustainability, possibly just missing the point of what they're doing. And I feel quite passionately that just simply banning older vehicles isn't the right way to go. There are clearly older vehicles that are more polluting in terms of NOx and other things that we should be conscious of, but also looking at the volume of mileage that a vehicle does, how much it used, how intensively it's used, how much it really actually impact. I think that it's quite different.
That was pretty deep, wasn't it?
I'm going to have a lie down now.
Yeah.
Do you know what? I've never done any form of track day racing in my life. I need to tick it off at some point, I think.
You do. You really do. Go and do it, because it is that difference between transportation and travel in a car and driving a car.
Oh, we'll have to go out. I'll take you out in the Porsche, John.
Yeah? Are you only good on the track?
I've done a little bit. I could do with some tuition. We'll have to hit Tim up and see if we can borrow him for a day one day.
Done. Next time you're on a track day, Andy, let me know.
Yeah. There you go.
Seems fine.
So yeah, big thank you, Tim. Thank you for sparing some time to chat with us. Really cool story. Really interesting. And hopefully I think everyone else will find that interesting as well.
Perfect. Well, look, really nice to speak to you both, and best of luck with the podcast.
Thanks, Tim. Nice to meet you. Take care.
Cheers.
Thank you very much, Tim. Have a good day.
And you. Bye.
So there we go. First racing driver. We're a step closer to Jensen Button.
We are a step closer. That was really good, wasn't it? I really enjoyed that.
Yes. Tim's really nice guy, and we kind of meandered a little bit, didn't we? But kept it fairly on topic.
Certainly the most track themed or race themed podcast that we've done so far, wasn't it? Which was quite nice in a way to see it through the eyes of someone that's always on the track, as it were.
Absolutely. I think what an opportunity as a child, like your dad decides to build a kart circuit.
Yeah, it kind of puts my sort of memories of just going down to the local cash and carry once every week.
Here's some, carry these fags.
Yeah, puts that to shame. Yeah, and now smell them.
Oh yeah, talking of scents, obviously a banana scented Mk2 Golf. If anyone out there's got a black C plate Mk2 GTI that smells of bananas, get in touch.
Yeah, do get in touch. Yeah, that's a really good one actually. Scents. I think we've missed that off our sort of to-do list of what we should ask people when we get them on.
Yeah.
It really sort of brought back a memory for me. The smell of my dad's silver Merc, the boot, always had like a sort of dampish smell to it. And to this day, me and my brother, if we ever sort of encounter that smell, sort of have a whiff of that. That's a real sort of dad's boot smell. It's not a particularly nice smell, but
yeah.
You know, do you know what I mean? You're sort of inclined to just give it a good old whiff, just to sort of step back down memory lane.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, big thanks to Tim for joining us.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. Let's roll the credits. Thanks for tuning in to My Dad's Car. We're new at this and really appreciate you listening and supporting the podcast. If you enjoyed it, please click subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Give us a follow on social media and tell your friends to tune in too if you think it will be up their street.